Thank you very much. Well, today I'm going to do something highly unusual, maybe even novel. I'm going to present an optimistic vision for the future of the country. And in particular, I'm going to revisit the relative cohort size hypothesis proposed by demographer Richard Easterlin in the 1960s. Easterlin argued that the economic and social prospects of a generation are influenced by the size of the cohort relative to surrounding cohorts, affecting wages, employment, marriage, and fertility decisions. And the general theory fits pretty well with the data on income and fertility and so on from 1940 to 1980, but then it completely fails in later decades. So Easterlin focused exclusively on the number of young men entering the labor force and competing for jobs. I propose measures that allow us to look at the impact of female labor force participation, immigration, and retirement on the competition for jobs. And the results, I think, suggest that the retirement of the baby boomers is going to have some profound consequences. This is not my first rodeo. This is actually my third appearance in the Notestein seminar. The first was in 2010 when I presented a comparative analysis of family composition. That was the opening slide. Then in 2018, I came back and I did a presentation on the history of the census. I enjoyed both of these tremendously. And you notice that I've now established a pattern of returning once every 8 years. And so I do have openings in 2034 and 2042 if you want to pencil me in. So this graph is from a 1971 New York Times article, New Census Trend, the Bulging Generation. The article explained that there was a bulge in the US population that resembled what happens when a pig is eaten by a python. The newspaper noted that in the graph, the baby boom age group sticks out like the python's dinner. All things being equal, the bulge moves gradually along the length of the snake until it is fully digested, which would cause continuing and considerable changes in American society for the next half century. 3 years later, the humorist Russell Baker, which you probably are mostly too young to know who he was, but he was probably one of the most widely read columnists in the country in the period in the 1970s. He again characterized the baby boom generation as a pig in the python, and he imagined a country dominated by the cohort as it passed through the stages of life. The chief difficulty arises from a very large body of people who are now under 30. Most of these people are not going to go away over the next 30 years. The bulge group will continue to dominate society as it passes through the decades like a pig through a python. As the bulge group passes into retirement age, the diminished young population would be increasingly hard taxed to pay retirement benefits for the aging majority. So here's the US total fertility rate from 1860 to 2023. Fertility declined steadily from 1860 to 1920 and then collapsed during the Depression. The baby boom after the war was an enormous reversal. So the pig and the python was at the center of one of the major demographic debates of the 20th century. Easterlin argued that the baby boom happened because the small cohorts born during the Depression had very high incomes compared with their parents, and that meant that they married early and they had lots of babies. They had such high incomes, he argued, because they faced little generational competition. There just weren't enough of them to fill all the available jobs, so wages rose. And this theory, again, fits the evidence pretty well from 1940 to 1980. In Easterlin's 1978 presidential address, he predicted that By 1984, the incomes of young people and fertility rates would rise because of a sharp decline in cohort size, so that the downward pressure on wages caused by the baby boom would be relieved as the new generation, smaller generation came in. That prediction was completely wrong. Here's the key graph from Easterlin's presidential address. And this is the basic measure he used, relative cohort size. It's the ratio of the number of men aged 15 to 29 divided by the number of men aged 30 to 64. So this is relative cohort size. And so when the ratio of 15 to 29 to 30 to 64 is low, that means wages are going to be high, fertility will be high, so Woody Carlson described this as the lucky few that were born during the Depression and came of age in the 1950s and early 1960s. Then the baby boomers hit the job market, and Easterlin predicted correctly that income and fertility started to fall dramatically. Then after 1984, Easterlin could see that this ratio was going to start declining sharply. And so he in his presidential address, he just made the prediction, incomes are going to go up, fertility is going to rise just in a few years after the address. And he also said that it's going to have lots of other consequences. So divorce, suicide, crime will decline. SAT scores, he said, were going to go through the roof. So Easterlin gave his presidential address right at the peak there of his relative cohort size, which should have been the darkest time. And so he figured he predicted that all these optimistic changes were going to occur just 6 years later in 1984, that it would all turn around. Well, this is what actually happened. These are the median wages for full-time wage earners from 1940 to 2023. As predicted by Easterlin's relative cohort size hypothesis, the small generation born in the Depression did incredibly well. Wages almost tripled over a few decades. Also, as predicted, when the mass of baby boomers hit the job market, wages went down. But contrary to Easterlin's prediction, wages didn't start rising again after 1984 or even after 1978. Here's 1984. Wages continued to drop after 1984. In fact, the low point of median wages for young full-time workers didn't come till 2014. There's been a small uptick since then, but overall median wages are still well below what they were in 1973. Women fared a bit better, but as late as 2019, women's real wages just matched their peak in 1973. So the gender gap has closed quite a bit over this period, but women are still making less than men. Well, Easterlin ignored women, and he argued that women's work was not relevant because women simply didn't compete for jobs with men. Women were nurses and school teachers, and men didn't do those jobs. And moreover, he argued that it was men's income that determines family formation, and that's what he was really interested in, was fertility. And so he thought that we could ignore women. Obviously, this is an absurd proposition from today's perspective. He also ignored immigration. But in fact, the relaxation of immigration restrictions in 1965 had a profound impact on the labor market. So immigration turns out to be important. And maybe most important, Easterlin ignored retirement. He thought, again, just like the argument with women, he thought retiring people, they don't have the same kind of jobs as people entering the labor force. People enter the labor force at the bottom of the ladder, and people exit it at the top of the ladder. So the retirement, since they're different kinds of jobs, the retirement is irrelevant. And even if it's true about the ladder, it seems to me that people if people leave from the top of the ladder, everybody gets to move up a rung, and eventually you're going to have some openings at the bottom of the ladder. In some cases, like for example, if you get a senior baby boomer faculty member, you can have them retire. That's enough to generate two or three new assistant professor positions. So retirement can be important. So to include these factors, we can measure labor flows. And the the net inflow into the labor force between 1970 and 1980, for example, for people aged 29 in 1980, you take the number of 29-year-olds in 1980, you subtract the number of 19-year-olds in 1970, then you repeat this for everybody aged 16 to 29 in 1980, and that yields net entries into the labor force for that age group over the decade. And I'm picking this age group because it's approximately the same. Of course, it's the age group that Easterlin was focused on. The measure is restricted to the U.S.-born population, and as I will explain, immigration has to be handled separately. So here's the same thing written as an equation. You just calculate the net additions to the labor force over the previous decade for each birth year. So it's very simple. And if you want to look at it as in a spreadsheet, the first column there is a number of people in the labor force in 1970. Second column is 1980. We take the 29-year-olds, subtract the 19-year-olds. That's the number of people who entered the labor force between ages 19 and 29 between 1970 and 1980. And you just repeat that for all the different ages, and you add it all up. And at the bottom, what we have is the number of people entering the labor force in those age groups during that decade. So if you want to do outflows, retirements, or deaths, or whatever makes people leave, we just flip around the same method. The net outflow between 1970 and 80 for people aged 60 in 1970. You take the number of 60-year-olds in labor force in 70, subtract the number of 70-year-olds in the labor force in 1980. That's the number of people who depart the labor force at that age in that period. And again, here's the equation, just the sum of the exits between age 50 and 99. So I calculate the flow separately for men and women. And I also look at women aged 30 to 49. For men in this age group, it's very uninteresting. They don't generally enter or leave the labor force in the 30 to 49 age group. But the women in the mid-late 20th century, as married women's labor force participation increased dramatically, it makes a big difference. Then I do immigrants separately. And so for immigrants, I just combine all the age groups. And the reason why is because with the immigrants, we don't know if they were in the country 10 years prior. And so you can't really do the cohort thing. And so I just very simply measure the growth or decline of the immigrant workforce, the total immigrant workforce over each decade. Other things, I did a simple forward survived population projection to bring the analysis out to 2040. I assume constant mortality and labor force participation and no changes in the immigrant workforce, which is probably not a valid assumption. But these are not too unreasonable assumptions. Mortality change may come, but it's going to be slow. And unless, of course, there's a complete collapse of the social fabric. And it's hard to imagine a big increase in the immigrant workforce. So I think these assumptions are pretty conservative. Okay, so this is the entrance and into the labor force each decade for people age 16 to 29. And you could see the huge uptick, which is the same as the uptick in the relative cohort size between 1950 and 1980. And it was very rapid. Um, uh, then there was a little bit of a dip afterwards, but the number of people entering the labor force. So this is absolute number of people, of course. It's not a rate, but the number of people entering the labor force actually peaked right now in the 2020s, and it'll start going down again. Uh, um, but if we compare that. It looks the whole graph looks a lot different than relative cohort size. Uh, um, uh, the if you remember, this is the relative cohort size graph, and this is the number of entrants into the labor force. And you got the same spike in between 1950 and 1980, but not nearly as sharp a decline after 1980. Okay, now here's the exits from the labor force among US born age 50 to 89. And they've gone up every decade since 1910, with the sole exception of the 1940s. Uh, and the pace of retirements, you can see up here, accelerated very rapidly in the 2010s. And you can see that women are catching up to men, and it looks like they're going to leave the labor force at the same rates by the 2030s. Here's the entrance in the labor force age 30 to 49. I just showed the women, like I said, because the men are boring. But you can see from 1910 to 1950, women in this age group were more likely to leave the labor force than to enter it because presumably they left the labor force when they got married or started having kids or something like that. But that reversed very sharply in the mid-century, and by the 1960s and 1970s, 3 or 4 million women were entering the labor force in this age group every decade. Here's the immigrants. So it's all age groups for the immigrants. And again, from 1920 to 1960, more immigrants left the labor force than entered it. For women, there wasn't really much of any effect, but for the men and for the overall immigrant labor force, there were more people leaving than entering. And that was mostly just because of retirements. Because in that period there were very few new immigrants to replenish the stock of workers, and because immigration restrictions between 1925 and 1965 were quite severe, and so the immigrant labor force declined. But there was a very sharp increase, peaking in the early 2000s, with after the liberalization of immigration law. So what this does is add together all of the graphs that I've just showed you. So this is just the overall number of decennial net entrants into the labor force for all groups. And you can see that this looks kind of like the overall relative cohort size graph. You got a huge increase with almost 25 million people entering the labor force during the 1970s. And some of this is the large cohorts of young baby boom men entering the labor force, but the increasing participation of women was an even bigger factor. And you can also see that we've got two spikes here, the spike of the 1970s, but then there's the spike of the 2000s. Spike of the 2000s is the immigration spike. So it kind of makes a interesting pattern. So after the 2000s, the number of entrants into the labor force declined dramatically, and I'm projecting that by the decade of the 2030s, the net entries into the labor force will fall virtually to zero. So that last graph is measured as the absolute number of workers. Obviously, there's a lot of population growth during this period, and so this graph just measures entrance into the labor force, the overall total grand total number, as a percentage of the working age population at the end of each decade. Uh, um, and So it looks a lot like the shape of the relative cohort size spike if I put those next to each other. The shape's a bit different, but it's the big spike is about the same period, and it falls off very, very dramatically at the end there. Um, so, but I don't think that this really is a valid measure of labor market competition. It makes it look like the 1950s had more competition than the 1990s. That's just wrong. Um, the economic opportunities before the big spike in the labor force were much better than they were afterwards. These baby boomers and the newly employed women and immigrants didn't vanish after they entered the labor force. They just kept working and occupying jobs until they retired eventually decades later. So, like the pig and the python, the bulge of workers just moved forward through time and suppressed the appetite for new employment. And so the glut of workers entering the labor force in the 1970s continued, I argue, to suppress labor demand until they were fully digested. And so to deal with this, I'm proposing an index of employment competition. And this is calculated as the net entries of the previous 5 decades. So I just add up all of those entries over 5 decades. That's a period long enough to encompass people's working careers generally. And so I measure those 5 decades of entrance as a percentage of the working age population in the current decade. And this pattern differs greatly from relative cohort size. And by this measure, instead of a reduction in job competition after 1980, competition continued to rise through the 1980s, and then it stayed pretty high until the 2010s, because basically the pig and the python was still there. So this is a lot more consistent if we compare the index of employment competition with the pattern of wages for young people who are full-time workers. Basically, workers were scarce during this upsurge in young adult wages between 1940 and 73, and competition for jobs was consistently high during the long stagnation of wages between 1973 and 2014. And so, given if we're looking at this measure of employment competition, it shouldn't be surprising that the wages for young people declined for 4 decades after their peak in 1973. Well, obviously, economic changes compounded the demographic challenges facing young workers in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, and 2010s. From the stagflation of the late 1970s to the Great Recession, there was continuing erosion of union representation, there was globalization, there was mechanization of production. Um, but if the demand for workers had exploded as Easterlin had predicted, those things might not have mattered so much. Labor would have had a lot more bargaining power in those decades. So the pig and the python, this vast cohort of baby boomers, augmented by the surge of women and immigrants into the labor force, stood in the way of Easterlin's golden age for young workers, suppressing wage growth for 4 decades. So in the current moment of political turmoil, economic predictions spanning the next 15 years have got to be pretty speculative. But we can predict the demographic configuration of the 2040 working age population. I mean, the births have already happened. Everybody who's going to be in the workforce in 2040 is already born. Like I said, mortality change moves relatively slowly. 15-year period, it's not likely to change too dramatically. And it does seem unlikely that we're going to see a massive surge of immigration over the next 15 years. Other factors may affect the prospects of new workers, including recessions. There could be sudden shifts in federal policies. Then the continued globalization and mechanization is possible. And it's also, of course, possible that artificial intelligence will dramatically reduce the demand for workers. But it's also possible or even probable that the magnitude of the coming demographic shift is big enough that it might swamp all of those changes. If there isn't an economic crisis, the drop in the labor market competition over the coming 2 decades is likely to improve the prospects of new entrants into the labor force. There's likely to be an unprecedented shortfall of new workers. This is going to create strong upward pressure on wages. We're already seeing signs of an uptick in the wages of young workers. It's gone up more in the last decade than at any time in the last 50 years. And as the demographic shortage accelerates, we might finally see real wages for the first time exceed the levels of the early 1970s. Americans born in the 2020s might be the first cohort in a half century that earns significantly more than their parents did. Labor force participation is likely to increase as more workers are pulled into the market by higher wages. Some workers will postpone retirement. The decline in labor competition should be a boon for labor organizing. There will be increased incentives for automation of both manufacturing and services. We can expect reduced inequality, especially generational inequality. And of course, the high demand for labor will create pressure to expand immigration. All of this assumes, of course, that society has not collapsed by 2040. There is still, of course, the problem of funding Social Security, as Russell Baker predicted in 1974. But this is a relatively short-term problem. The baby boomers are going to start dying off rapidly after 2040. So Easterlin's relative cohort size hypothesis was oversimplified because it ignored the effects of retirement, female labor force participation, and immigration. But it did identify a key mechanism. The relative number of people entering the labor force has powerful implications for economic opportunity. Fluctuations in the number of workers entering the labor force were probably the biggest drivers of the dramatic swings in wages from the 1940s to the 1980s. And they also had important consequences for marriage rates and fertility. So in that sense, Easterlin was right. But as the pig and the python is finally digested over the next several decades, the coming transformations may be even greater than the demographic and economic boom and bust of the mid 20th century. Now, there's a new paper just out by Nicholas Reynolds that is very interesting and relevant here. Elizabeth Wrigley Field, one of my colleagues, just uh, pointed this out to me after she read my paper. So Reynolds is an early career scholar at the University of Essex. He's only published a couple of things, but this is one of them. And he points out that the 1947 birth cohort had higher wages across their entire lives than any other birth cohort before or after. But that wasn't the only thing that makes them unique. There's many other bad things that happened after 1947 cohort. Education, men's wages, women's and maternal health, and mortality all exhibit trend breaks near the 1947 cohort, such that each outcome worsens for subsequent cohorts relative to prior trend. So let me show you some of these numbers. This is median hourly wages for men in panel A. Panel B there, he uses the percentage of women with low birth weight of their children by the birth cohort of the mother. Here's men's log mortality by birth cohort and women's log mortality. And you can see a big shift in the trend. Here's men's years of schooling. Again, the peak in 1948 in this instance. For women, the years of schooling has continued to go up, but there's a clear discontinuity in the trend line that occurred around 1947. So he detrends these things and comes up with these things. So we've got men's wages, low birth weight, men's mortality, women's mortality, men's years of schooling, and women's years of schooling detrended. And it seems fairly striking. So the paper goes through a bunch of potential explanations for what was it about 1947, and he rejects them all the hypotheses except for two. And he says, well, it might have something to do with an Easterland cohort size type of thing, although he points out the obvious fact that it persisted too long for relative cohort size to explain things. Should have turned around by 1984. And then the other thing he talks about is lead pollution from motor vehicles, which was phased out in the U.S. between 75 and 96. And he comes to the conclusion that sharp tests of these and other hypotheses will require large samples that link granular information on individuals' early life circumstances to their outcomes as adults. So, where would we get those? Well, I have we are on the verge of having data like we've never ever had before. The Census Bureau's Decennial Census Digitization and Linking Project is digitizing the names from the censuses of 1960 through 1990. They will be picked and we have, of course, the multi-generational longitudinal panel has already linked 680 million people or 680 million links from 1850 to 1950. And we have and we are continuing to link these data to a bunch of different surveys of aging to adult changes in survey to the Social Security Numident, and now we've just embarked on linking MLP to the National Death Index. Um, Meanwhile, of course, within the Census Bureau, there's a wide range of surveys and administrative records from all over the federal government that have been picked. So we're building the data that would be needed to look at the very granular level at lead pollution exposures and their impact on later life. And we can look at these outcomes over a very long period of time. So I'm very excited about that. So that's the end